And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the lab webinar for tonight. We are really pleased to have the program tonight. And to introduce that program, I'd like to introduce board member Rebecca Fenning-Marshall, who will introduce our speakers. Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for tonight's webinar. Dr. Cin-Ty Lee grew up in Southern California and has been birding since he was in junior high. He has lived in Texas for the last 18 years, where he's a professor of geology at Rice University in Houston. In addition to his academic work in geology, he writes and consults about birds and the environment and stays busy birding, recording night flight calls, drawing, and painting. Andy Birch is a well-known illustrator of birds, and over the last 30 years, Andy has illustrated identification plates for field guides and created brilliant illustrations for the front covers of major birding magazines in North America and Europe. Andy's also been birding since childhood and has been birding in LA County for 25 years. He can usually be found looking for birds during his lunch break in Griffith Park and along the LA River in Glendale and Los Feliz. And I know that many of us have gone chasing the birds that Andy is so good at finding. Cin-Ty and Andy have written a number of articles on challenging bird identification for various magazines and journals over the past several decades, and they've recently published the first two books in their three-book series on flycatchers for Princeton University Press. Volume 1, Empidonax to Peewees, was released in 2023, and Volume 2, Kingbirds to Myiarchus, was released earlier this spring. So without further ado, please welcome Cin-Ty and Andy.
Thank you.
Andy, I think you're up.
Let's see. I think I'll share. Here we go.
Yeah. Ah, there you go.
Let's see.
And presentation mode, you're all set.
Is that showing the presentation mode? That's weird.
No, it's in speaker mode.
Oh, here we go.
No.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
Ah, there you go. Perfect.
Yeah, and let me see if I can get pointer here. Where did the pointers there?
There you go. That looks good.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for having Andy and me here. It's good to see you all again. So what we're going to do is split this talk into two parts. This is Volume 2, Flycatchers of North America, Kingbirds and Myiarchus. And I'll take the Myiarchus, and Andy will come in and do the Kingbirds about halfway in. And I thought some of you may have seen the Volume 1, the Empidonax and Peewees talk. So we won't spend much time on it, but I thought it would still be useful to just have a couple of slides on that Volume 1 and what we had tried to do. And that was an entire book on about 20 species of birds, peewees and Empidonax, flycatchers. And we felt that they were such difficult, challenging bird IDs that it really warranted a dedicated book. And one of the things we wanted to do was show how when you tackle these really tough ID problems, you really have to take a holistic approach in birding or bird identification. So we'd focus on shapes and proportions, contrasts, voice, habitat, behavior, seasonal status, all of those combined sort of the holistic approach. And here we're showing how you don't emphasize color, but mainly all these relative contrasts in shape, size, and color contrast rather than absolute colors. So this is a plate from the book. Andy's great illustrations there, and with MPIDs, we focused on things like primary projection, wing bar contrast, did a lot with the maps of when these birds arrive, where they breed, etc. And you might ask, well, what's different with Volume 2, with Kingbirds and Myiarchus? Well, of course, we tackle a different group of birds here, and they require a little bit of different treatment because I can show you, and I'll start with Myiarchus here, that in things like primary projection, in the case of Myiarchus, don't work so well. And instead, it's mainly the relative color contrasts and tail patterns that we'll talk about. Kingbirds, the primary projections are important, but not so much for the Myiarchus. So in this book, just like in volume 1, we spend the first third of each section as an introduction of really how to see all these different or these subtle field marks rather than get straight into the species accounts. So we encourage readers to focus on that part. And so what we did in this one, here Andy's lined up all the Myiarchus together in sort of the order of approximate color intensity from Las Sagres, which you won't get in California, of course, which is very dull, all the way to great crested, which I'm sure is a bird you really want to see in California during fall migration. It's a very bright, contrasty sort of bird, and then you got everything in between. And so to the untrained eye, of course, the Myiarchus all look like they have rufous wings, rufous in their tails, yellowish bellies, but it's about the intensities of these colors. So for example, great crested has a strong contrast between the throat, the gray throat and chest, and the bright yellow underparts. And you go to ash-throated out here in the West, where it's all muted colors and just a hint of yellow below, or lemon yellow, pale yellow, and it gradually grades into a light gray chest. And here, showing you different chest contrasts. You can, when you photograph a bird, see a bird, pull up Andy's plates and just line them up, and is it a weak contrast like an ash-throated or something strong? And other contrasts that are worth paying attention to are face contrasts here. So some of the birds have kind of a paler face, some of them have a darker face, dark crown. And you really want to look at the face relative to the throat, to the crown. So ash-throated, it's all overall pale, but has a dark crown relative to a medium cheeks, and then pale throats there. Other contrasts that we want to focus on are wing panel contrast, which was something we talked about for Empidonax. In this case, the Myiarchus, they all have sort of rufous edges on the primaries, pretty much all of them. But some of them, the secondaries are really edged in white. And so you have this white panel and a rufous panel here, or some you might have more rufous in the panel, secondary panels, and some somewhere in between, like a Nutting's flycatcher. Also, take a look at the wing bars. Myiarchus wing bars are all sort of dull compared to what you might see in the Empids, but even within the dull kind of regime, you will have something like a great crested, which would have brighter wing bars, and then a dusky cap, which has wing bars, which are the same intensity of color as the mantle. So they don't really pop out, as you can see here. And one of the unique things about Myiarchus is tail pattern, in particular the undertail pattern. You really have to look at the underside and not the upper side. And in most cases, they have a lot of rufous in them, to sort of limited rufous, but still a little bit. But what's important to look at is that they also have a brown outer margin to the tail feathers. In some cases, the brown outer margin is pretty thick, like in brown crested. Some cases it's thin in gray crested. And then some it's so broad that you really don't see the rufous unless it truly fans its tail, like in dusky capped right here. And other things to pay attention to are the shape of how this brown outer margin terminates at the end of the tail. And ash-throated in California, one of the key features, at least for adults, is that this hooks around and almost covers the tip, makes a dark bar across the tip. And some of the vagrants that you might get, like great crested or brown crested out in the deserts, they don't ever hook in. Nuttings is somewhat in between, of course. And we'll talk about that in a second. We won't spend too much time on vocalizations, but it's important to, whenever you're out looking at the birds and looking at the visual ID marks, if you have a chance, record the birds' vocalizations. Use your iPhone. They have a wide variety of calls, and many of them are quite distinct or even unique. But we have put them in sort of this chart here to help you learn the calls or classify the calls better. So, for example, some of the birds have these weep type calls, nuttings, and great crested for sure. But ash-throated doesn't have a rising weep call. So if you hear a weep in California, you should get excited there. And if we hear, a chakir type of call out in the east, we get excited. It might be an ash-throated. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of go through the species accounts through the Myiarchus, and then I'll turn it over to Andy to talk about the kingbirds. So ash-throated flycatcher is like actually most of the Myiarchus, they are birds of the West. We don't really have too much in the East. And ash-throated is essentially your common one that you should really learn. It's mostly there it breeds up in the West, and it's fairly rare, at least in California in the winter. You can find them in Arizona in the winter and all the way out to Texas in the winter. But ash-throated is sort of a pale flycatcher with low contrast between the chest and the belly, light lemon yellow belly. In worn birds, it can be almost lacking in color. Rufous in the primary edges, and in the adults, the secondary panel will tend to be very white. So we call that a very strong wing panel contrast. And then once again, that tail pattern in adults is about as distinctive as one can be for the Myiarchus. And they have these distinct chakir type calls, which sounds like a referee whistle. So here are some photos to show you how the strong wing panel contrast. Here's a blow up here. You can see it in all of these images here. You can see the pale throat here, sort of medium crown, the medium-sized bill, a medium intensity crown. The tail, this just shows from above. It's not very diagnostic. All Myiarchus tails tend to be brown or dull. Here are some from the other angle. Now, from the other angle from below, you can see that distinct tail pattern where it hooks, the dark brown outer margin hooks around inward here. And you see in all of these photos, the pale yellow belly and grading gradually up to the light gray chest. So very low contrast here. And so that's a typical ash-throated. Now I put a couple of photos here. One is a very worn adult in June from New Mexico, and you can see this can happen in the summer to a lot of the flycatchers, that they get worn out, and so the wing bars are almost non-existent. They're kind of frayed away, and the tertial edges are almost gone, and there's only a hint of rufous here, barely, and it doesn't even look yellow underneath. So you do have to pay attention to wear and tear. And then at the other extreme, you might get the first year birds, and particularly in fall before they've gone through their first pre-basic molt. They can be more brightly colored. The secondary panels, instead of being white, can be rufous or yellow. So a little bit like Nutting's flycatchers. You got to be careful of that. And then the tail pattern, unfortunately, they don't show that hooking as much in these first-year birds. So beware of those problems. And these are cases where you really got to pay attention to calls, for example. Brown-crested flycatcher, another bird that you of course get out in California, but they tend to be pretty rare. Vagrants is remarkable that it's not that many miles away from where they breed in the Mojave, but along the coast they're not too common. They have large bills, especially the ones out west where you all are, and in good light, they actually do have a brown crest, but things that I use overall is that it tends to be a more contrasty bird than ash-throated. It's yellower underneath, and gray on the chest might be just a tad bit darker. The bird tends to be less slender than ash-throated. It has kind of a pot-bellied appearance that Andy captured quite well here. The tail pattern, just a straight brown outer margin with almost no hooking at the bottom at the termination. And that's typically strong wing panel contrast with maybe the last secondary right here, showing a little bit of rufous. You do have to be careful if you venture out to Texas that there are two subspecies in the in North America. That's the one we have here in Texas, and they look almost identical, except they're a little bit smaller and a slightly smaller bill. And so out here where I am in Texas, they can be more easily confused with ash-throated than out where you guys are. They have very different calls. They have a bird call that ash-throateds do not have. So here's some photos. Look at the brown outer margin. It's really straight. The brighter yellow underparts right here, a little bit more contrast, little brighter wing bars. That lowermost secondary has a little bit of rufous on it, which is typically lacking in ash-throated, but a heavy bill. These are Arizona ones, the ones you'll get here. You have the liquid whip call, these short churtles. Bulkier bird. It's a big-headed, heavy-chested bird. Even these smaller ones from Texas, but you can still see here that broad, straight outer margin, bright yellow underparts, and so forth. Here, look how broad that margin. It does not hook around. Great crested flycatcher, a bird that, of course, is a much sought-after vagrant in California. It's an eastern bird, but they do venture out here in fall, mostly in fall. And for us out here, we recognize these great crested. They're really distinctive birds. They are really bright yellow, dark upper parts. It's gray here, but it's a darker gray than any other Myiarchus, and so it often has this hooded appearance, and that's a strong contrast between the gray chest and the yellow belly. The bill is medium to large. The dark face, auriculars, is something to pay attention to, and because of that, we've noticed that in almost all great crested, they have like this partial white eye ring. The lower rear of the eye is a little bit bordered with white. Adults typically have a strong wing panel contrast. They also have a very strong tertial white edging on the tertial that really stands out. The back can sometimes look a little bit green. It's the only Myiarchus that shows that. It may not always be greenish, but if you see green, it's probably a great crested. And yeah, I'll show you some photos here of the great crested. Look at the strong contrast between the chest and the belly and how bright the bird is, how contrasty, bright wing bars for a Myiarchus at least. In each of these, you see that little lower arc at the crescent of the eye. And I forgot to mention, they often show a pale base to the bill right here, and see it in all of these. And the tail from the underside is also quite apparent, that tail pattern. I should also note that great crested, so Myiarchus all have short primary extensions. And we almost never talk about primary extension from Myiarchus, but great crested is an exception. Its primary extension is long for Myiarchus. And it is actually our longest distance migrant, so it makes sense that as a long primary projection. So if you see something like a nutting, something or dusky cap, which are local, they have very short primary projection, but great crested as long ones. Here are more photos showing you the strong pale base of the bill, tail pattern here. This is a first cycle bird in May. This is a juvenile. Again, in juveniles, there can be a little bit more color in the tertial, so one has to be careful with that field mark. As long as you age the bird properly, uh, you can use these marks. Dusky capped, the birds of the Southwest, but of course, California gets, it's quite a few of them in the fall and we're staying over through the winter, and Texas gets some, although it's a different subspecies, a brighter subspecies from the Gulf of Mexico, but they have thinner bills, straighter bills, very weak wing bars, a darker bird, aptly named dusky cap. They have a dark cap and face almost. The chest is dark, not as dark as up here, but you tend to see quite a contrast all over on the bird. Typically, you don't see much rufous showing in the tail, so it'll usually look very dark, but be careful, you're not looking at a bird's tail in the shade. They can all Myiarchus tails can look dark if not lit up properly. So here's some dusky cap. They have a distinct call that you can be heard from long distances. It's a mournful pew, and often that's the first hint that you've got one of these. They tend to be in more denser vegetation or wooded areas, so you may not notice them as easily as, say, an ash-throated, but you'll hear them call. So look at these bills, narrow, small, or thinner bill, the darker cap, the muted wing bars, and the rufous in both the wing panels. So very low wing panel contrast, and no rufous in the tail. And here is the Texas one, or the Caribbean side. I put this in because California seems to get every vagrant at some point in its history, and so it's not entirely impossible that one of these might wander all the way over to California one day. But they're essentially the same, but they're just brighter overall and really bright rufous edges. So it might look more like a juvenile dusky cap there. Nuttings. So nuttings is one that everyone wants to see. They're rare in general. In fact, mostly in Southeast Arizona, but California has a number of records. And as of the writing of our book, Texas only had one record, but just this past fall, we had several down in Big Bend over here, and then another one just showed up in Corpus Christi a couple weeks ago. So we probably need to revise this. But nuttings is a subtle bird, but the thing to look at for nuttings is, I always say, as it's somewhere in between a dusky capped and an ash-throated, and it always gives you confusion when you encounter nuttings. You get people arguing, oh, that looks like a dusky cap, but something's not right, or that looks like an unusually bright ash-throated, but it might not be an ash-throated. When you're starting to have those confusions, and you're calling it dust capped and someone else is calling it ash-throated, you should think, oh, maybe I should take nuttings seriously here. So they're a brighter bird. One of the main features to look at is the secondary panel. The lower part will have rufous edges and they'll gray gradually to the white, so gradual gradation. So it's like a moderate wing panel contrast. The tail pattern, it is not straight to the end. It kind of bleeds inwards at the tip, but typically does not hook all the way in over here. Short primary projection. Here showing you the tail patterns of them in flight. You can see it widens a little bit, but it's not really hooking. But because it widens, you can kind of rule out something like brown crested or great crested. It tends to be brighter below. Often it does have a little bit of pale base to the bill. The call is very distinctive. They give a rising weep call, very much like great crested, or a whistle to wits, a little bit like brown crested, but very different from what you would get in a dusky capped or an ash-throated flycatcher. And here are some other photos showing you, look how short these primary extensions are. Again, all Myiarchus have relatively short ones, but this is unusually short. This one's from Costa Rica, and here's some ones from Texas. And here you can see that gradual gradation in the secondary feather edges from rufous to yellow coming up. Fairly bright tertials to pay attention to. It has a cute appearance, a rounded head, dove-shaped head, again, hearkening dusk cat, but not as slender, a little bit plumper, dumpier than the other flycatchers. And one other thing that you've probably seen in previous literature is that the mouth lining. And you might go, how am I ever going to see the mouth lining? Well, Nuttings, if it opens its mouth, it hits a bright orange that you can see here. And then ash-throated, it's pink, as you can see here. And one of the things we've noticed is Nuttings, they call a lot. And this weep call, rising weep call, when they do that, they really open their mouths. Often their head goes back. And then the ash-throated, it's actually quite hard to get a photo of an ash-throated with its mouth open. It has a different type of call. It's not this rising weep. It's like these pips, and it just doesn't open its mouth much. In fact, in this case, this was a bird that was yawning. I've been trying to get a calling ash-throated to open its mouth, but they just don't do it. They're like trying to speak with their lips not opening, whereas Nuttings will open its mouth quite often. Last but not least, for the Myiarchus, just for completeness, the Sagres flycatcher, it's not something you'll probably ever get in California, but they're pretty much like, the closest would be an ash-throated, but they are very muted in colors, no rufous, almost no rufous in the tail. Here you can see only when they spread it out completely, you see some pale inner webs, but it's not really a rufous right here. So this is a Caribbean specialty, and has regularly wanders to Florida, southern Florida and the Keys, with one crazy record for Alabama. So it could wander, but very, very unlikely to wander to the west. And after all that discussion, I just put this up. It's basically a summary of everything we've said that Andy's put together, and you can use that in the field guide as you cut it out or take a photo of it and use it when you're going out to the field. And here, just to show you the ones you get in California, plus the little rarity right here. In comparison, look how brightly and marked the great crested is, and contrast the bright wing bars here, dark face, dark chest. All the other extreme is the pale ash-throated here. So these are all subtle differences, but hopefully you can see that. The same birds from the front, showing you how the tail patterns are quite different. So if you have a flycatcher, a Myiarchus, make sure you get a photo of the undertail or study it very carefully. And again, look how strong this contrast is, and even a greenish tint here on the great crested, which you would never see on the two western birds that you would get out in California. And just for completeness here, this is just showing you, because it's hard to put all the birds side by side. You usually don't get Myiarchus sitting next to each other. So here they are dead, lying next to each other. But we ordered them in this case by size, and you can see dusk cap. It's a small flycatcher, and something like great crested and brown crested. These are big flycatchers. And then Nuttings. Nuttings is again somewhere in between ash-throated and Nuttings in terms of size. So you can see the same thing here. And here we've ordered them in terms of intensity of color. And you can study this later if you want. But the brightest ones are up here with great crested and brown crested. And ash-throated is the most pale one, but Nuttings is somewhere in between again, dusky capped and ash-throated. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy. We just did Myiarchus, and he'll do the kingbirds. And these are the other, by the way, flycatchers that we will talk about for volume 3. But Andy will do the kingbirds. So
thank you.
Take it away, Andy.
Thank you. So kingbirds, a little more striking with colors and contrasts, a little more colorful, but they still come with their challenges, and we'll talk about some of the most challenging aspects of kingbird identification. But again, taking that sort of holistic view, we're looking at a variety of features, body color. As you can see, there's quite a range there from black and white through to gray and yellow. Shape and structure. You've got birds like thick-billed kingbird, which LA birders, occasionally get to see a wintering vagrant. We had one in Griffith Park this year, which just came back for its 2nd year. But look at the size of that bill, and its plumage and structure is really quite unlike anything on any other kingbird you would see out here in California. We have loggerhead in there as well, but loggerhead's a bit like Lasagras. It's a Caribbean species that you should never ever encounter in California, but you can't rule anything out, I guess. Let's go to the next slide. Head contrast is important when we're looking at our two, regularly occurring kingbirds, Western and Cassins. Cassins tends to be a darker gray head with a more contrasting white chin and sides of the auriculars. Tail pattern can be quite distinctive. Eastern kingbird has this black tail with white tips, whereas Western has a black tail with a very obvious white outer web to the outer tail feather. One thing we should note, which is true both with kingbirds and the Myiarchus, is when you're looking at them from below, the tail feather you're seeing is the outermost tail feather. When it's at rest, that is your R6, they call it, the outermost tail feather. So on the Western, you are seeing the white outer web to the outermost tail feather. When the tail is spread, obviously you'd see it spread out. And Cassins is in there, generally has a dark tail, but as we'll mention here, be very, very wary. John Feenstra did an excellent webinar on kingbirds, a couple of years ago, and that was sort of brought up there that Cassins can have quite a pale outer web to its outer tail feather, particularly on worn birds. Primary projection is more useful on kingbirds compared to Myiarchus. Examples being tropical kingbird and even Couch's kingbird having relatively short primary projections compared to Western kingbird and Cassins. I mean, this Western here is obviously, you can see, very long. That's something you would notice quite easily in the field, even at a distant view. And certainly with fairly basic photographs, you'd see that difference. One thing to note is that in these kingbirds, the shape of the outer primaries is another useful characteristic for sexing them, and that the males have these very pointed, notched outer primary. Juveniles, none at all, and females less so. And so as you're photographing kingbirds bombing through Bear Divide, if you've got decent photographs, you might be able to sex many, most, maybe nearly all of them. As well as we'll mention here, there are some useful sort of differences in the primary structure between some of these kingbirds that would even help you identify them as they're bombing through in flight. Next slide. Here's just an overall comparison. I don't know that we'll go into too much detail on this. Western and Cassins are at the bottom there. These are the familiar kingbirds, the Western being a summer migrant, Cassins year-round. You can see the differences there in the head pattern. You can see differences in how the yellow of the breast, meets on the breast with the gray throat. Usually on Cassins, it's quite dark gray there. There's quite a dark contrast. If we looked at Couch's and tropical, we'll see tropical often has quite a greenish, dull green sort of breast where it meets the throat, whereas Couch's is quite bright yellow there. And then we can see some differences in bill size, and we'll get into those as we go through the species. And on the right-hand side there, we look at some of the general differences in primary structure. I don't think anybody's advocating that you identify a kingbird to species necessarily using this method, but it can be a useful addition to the tool when you're looking at things holistically. And we have some underside shots there because that's often how we see kingbirds when they're above us, sitting and flying. All right, let's go on to a little more detail of that. Look at those long wings of Western and Cassins. There's a slightly different spacing of the primaries on Cassins as well. Couches and Tropical much shorter, although Couches does have a slightly, on average, a slightly longer primary projection than Tropical. I think Couches and Tropical will be very difficult to try and identify in flight, although there are some subtle differences. Western and Cassins, however, I think can be much more identifiable in flight. That outer primary on Cassins is quite short compared to Western. There is a slightly different shape to that wingtip. If you were to, in a good photograph, you can count the primaries and sort of see where primary 5 and 6 fall relative to each other and how that outer primary looks. Western tends to have very long, thin primaries as well, which creates this more pointed wingtip. All right, here we go. It's an in-flight shot. Again, might be useful for people taking photos at places like Bear Divide. You can see the difference in where primary 5 sticks out a little bit more. You can see how primary 10's a lot shorter on Cassins versus Western as well. And actually, if Ted's watching, I meant to text him and ask him if it's all right to use his photo. So many thanks, Ted, for letting us use your photo. I know you didn't give me permission. Sorry. It's a great photo, though. All right, moving on. Western kingbird. This is obviously familiar to all of us in spring, quite rare in our area in the wintertime. There are records of late fall birds and midwinter birds, but generally pretty rare. It's mostly a spring, summer visitor. I think the key things to look at here are that head pattern and where the white below the eye goes. It usually extends beyond the eye on Western, whereas in Cassins it tends to fall sort of level with the eye. There's a little less contrast usually on the head between the gray head and the white throat. Notice the wings generally are not too well patterned. There's not a lot of pale edging on the coverts there. And then of course, you know, the big key difference is that tail. It's a black tail, a contrasting black tail with a white, strong white outer web. And then I think Cin-Ty was also pointing there at the long primary projection, which this species has. And also call is distinctive too. Here we have some, here's some call descriptions with the twitters and the pip that it makes. Here's some in-flight birds, you know, showing off that white outer web to that black tail, along with those long, thin outer primaries. And generally fairly little contrast on the chest there, where the yellow belly meets the gray. Okay, some more shots of this species. Notice how the white below the eye sort of extends beyond the eye on this species. Notice how plain those wing coverts are, not a lot of pale edging on them, fairly plain wings. And of course, again, long primaries, particularly on the bird Cin-Ty has there, those long sort of saber-like primaries, which you wouldn't see on a tropical, for instance. All right. Cassin's kingbird, you know, obviously super familiar for all of us here in LA County, the bird we see pretty much year round, very distinctive call, and we can find them seemingly pretty much anywhere. Certainly I can in my area. Dark gray head contrasting with the chin and the white below the eye, which generally ends, you know, below the eye. Quite a lot of pale edging on the coverts. It also has long primary projection. It also has quite a lot of contrast between the yellow belly and where the gray meets. It's quite a contrasting bird there. And then the underside of the tail, if you see it, it's generally, you know, not as black as Western kingbird and should lack any obvious white outer webs to its outer tail feathers. Of course, you know, there are many examples, and I think even the introductory slide we had here shows that there's a lot of caution that should be taken with this feature in particular, with the sun shining through a bird's tail can make it look like it has quite white outer webs. And other times just very sort of worn birds can also look quite pale on the edging there. It also shows quite pale tips to the end of the tail as well. Just something to be aware of if you are confusing it possibly with a poor view of an eastern kingbird, for instance. Let's move on. I think actually maybe go back. One thing, you know, it is interesting. We on a number of these slides we show the red patch in the crown feathers. It's something that you generally would say you generally don't see, but in fact quite a lot of photographs I've noticed recently of people capturing this. So it's often hidden, but it does often, particularly when the bird is being aggressive in some way or flaring its crown, you will often see this neat red patch of crown feathers, which, you know, all of the kingbirds show. Cassin's kingbird, very distinctive call, brewery call, barbecue call, as Cin-Ty has described it here. We hear this a lot. Would recommend you go to Xenocanto or scroll through Macaulay if you want to get familiar with the call. These photos show quite well a lot of the features we've been talking about, particularly that flying bird shows that contrast between the gray chest and the yellow belly, and the bird below it shows that sort of contrast, strong contrast between those dark sort of mask, those dark auriculars, and the white below the eye on both of these birds. And again, I think that bird Cin-Ty's probably pointing out looks like a male, very notched. See those notched primaries there? And that very short outer primary, all of that distinctive for a male Cassins. Let's move on. Here we show the primary projection. Cin-Ty's pointed it out on this slide. You know, one thing we do see a lot on Cassins is this often quite a large gap in the primaries. I think it's between primary 4 and 5, something like that. There is a large sort of step in the primaries, less ordered than a Western kingbird that tends to be more evenly spaced. Again, not anything that should be considered diagnostic, but certainly something a lot of birds seem to show. And again, these birds show that sort of classic darker gray head with the contrasting white chin that ends sort of roughly around where the eye is. It doesn't bleed on beyond the eye as it would in Western. All right. Onwards, here's a nice comparison of Western and Cassins, where you can see the differences in the pale edging on the wing coverts. You can see the difference in where the white below the eye, more contrasting and doesn't extend as far back. And obviously with Western, that very jet black tail with the white outer web is clearly seen. And the long primaries of both. You can see Cassins here, slightly shorter primaries, but both have pretty long primaries. Okay. Tropical kingbird, which is a vagrant for us here. You know, we tend to get them in the fall and the winter when they do occur, and there's usually, it seems like these days, there's usually 1 or 2 available in the county every winter somewhere. It's a brighter, more contrasting bird than Western kingbird. It has a sort of dingy chest, a bit like a Cassin, so there is room for confusion though. Instead of it being gray dingy, it tends to be a greenish dingy. It tends to have a fairly big, long bill, more greenish on the back. It does not have any white in the outer tail feathers like Western kingbird would. But notice that the primary projection is shorter. It has a fairly short primary projection. And this is a species that interestingly wanders quite a lot. I mean, it's a vagrant all the way, you know, on the west coast, but also on the east coast. It's a large number of vagrant records all the way up into the northeast. Another key feature of this species is its call. It's sort of insect-like twittering call, which is unlike any kingbird. You know, is unlike obviously Western and Cassins. Okay. Is the highlighting again this twittering call that, you know, they're often quite vocal. But I think the key takeaways here is just look at that bill, see how large and bulky that bill is. certainly on the bird on the left in California. Notice that shortish primary projection. Notice a rather green back, and you know, on the two birds on the left and in the middle, you can't really see the yellow too well, but what you can see of it looks very bright lemon yellow. The bird on the right shows a sort of greenish, sort of dingy sort of chest band that this species shows, which is going to be important when we talk about couches next. And they often show quite a forked tail as well. The bird on the left certainly shows that. Okay. Here's some flight shots. These ones actually sort of show how much primary 5 extends out, and which is sort of useful in comparison to the other kingbirds, and we'll talk about that when we look at couches. But in these shots, notice sort of how kind of dingy that breast band is there. And obviously no patterning in the tail, just plain dark tails. And you can kind of see that certainly the bird bottom left also shows quite a forked tail, and they're generally heavy-billed bird. All right. Couches. So only a couple of California records, still very rare. It is actually a regular wanderer all the way up to North Texas, and there are a few records all the way out to the northeast. So a bird that's capable of wandering, and maybe we'll do another Southern California vagrant in the not too distant future. Very similar to tropical kingbird indeed. It has a short primary projection, although it is slightly longer than tropical. The main separation differences between couches and tropical, this bright yellow breast that often lacks a strong sort of greenish suffusion where it meets the white throat. It's often cleaner there. It's got a nice sort of powdery blue-gray head, although there's much variability there. In general, it tends to show a shorter, stouter bill than tropical. I think there are some slight differences in the primary structure as well, particularly on flying birds. You may see it if it's a good shot. But probably the most important thing is call, is how you want to separate this from tropical. Unfortunately, it can be also quite a vocal bird. So if you ever suspected couches, I would hope it could call and you could get a recording. All right. Here's some couches photos. I think these photos show, in comparison to those tropicals earlier, a shorter, stouter bill, a bright yellow breast, contrasting with the white throat, a nice sort of powder blue-gray head. And then these calls are marked here: a breer call and a pip call, and an eat. And certainly the breers should help separate it from a suspected tropical, if that's your other candidate bird. Also quite a forked tail on this species as well, and generally a fairly shortish primary projection, although as I noted, it is often generally slightly longer than tropical. All right. Here's some flying shots of couches. With some showing some of the slight differences in the spread wing of this species. Again, I don't think anybody should try to separate these two purely on this alone, but it could be a helpful addition to many other features, most notably call. This is what you should be focusing on. Moving on. Here's the two side by side, and there's a good comparison. You can see slight differences in bill here. Slightly stouter, more conical bill. I think in general, and Cin-Ty, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think, you know, on couches, which you see much more regularly in Texas, I think the confusion species maybe is possibly Western kingbird rather than tropical kingbird, maybe. You know, there's certainly maybe some more structural similarities with Western kingbird versus tropical for couches. But both of these species have nice bright yellow bellies. Okay. Thick-billed kingbird. I don't know that we need to dwell too much on this, other than, you know, we can look at sort of its range of wandering. It does reach obviously California and has wandered into the interior of Texas, but it generally is pretty rare in the US outside of southeast Arizona. But it does seem to be a sort of rare vagrant, regular vagrant to California. But the structure of this bird, very, you know, immatures can be very bright yellow, but generally it's got quite a lot of yellow on the belly, but a really unmistakable structural and plumage on this species. It has a fantastic call, a chewy call that's highly distinctive, carries from a long distance. And that may well be your first way of finding a thick-billed kingbird is hearing it. All right, let's move on. Here's a few photos. It's a chewy call is referenced. Very worn bird there from Arizona in the middle. You know, showing just how yellowish the bird can be below on the left and on the right, and also in flight. Okay. Here, you know, we have a nice comparison to put them all together. I think we've got sort of you've got yellow intensity and size there. Obviously, thick-billed's the biggest. Notice how Western and Cassins have quite a sort of dirty sort of breast band compared to obviously thick-billed, but even also couches and tropical. You can see the difference we've talked about there a little bit on tropical and couches. You know, tropical tends to have a dirtier green breast band there compared to couches, which tends to be brighter yellow all the way up to the top. And then here, yes, you can see it on the side there as well. Cassins, look how dirty and dark that bird is on the breast band. Okay. Eastern kingbird, very distinctive, black and white kingbird. Often, if you're going to encounter one in LA County in the spring, it's often a one-day bird or less, as they tend not to hang around. But you know, we have seen in recent years some young birds that have stuck around in the fall, giving us a chance to see this species out here. But generally, it's a rare vagrant, but fairly unmistakable. I would say those white tips to the tail feathers are very distinctive, along with that black and white body plumage. Again, on this picture, we're showing the difference between male and females on the wing pattern there. That again, you know, Eastern kingbird, the male had these notched outer primaries, allowing us to sex the bird. Long primary projection on this one as well. It's a long range migrant, and often actually in spring migrates in groups as well. Okay. Gray kingbird. You know, you can never say never. Obviously, highly unlikely this would ever turn up in California, but there are certainly a number of records along the East Coast, all the way up to the Northeast. I think we've got 4 records on the coast, and then I think in the spring they're more interior vagrancy records. But generally, this is a bird you'd be looking for, you know, in the Caribbean region. Similar to tropical, really, in many ways, in terms of its structure, but less so in plumage. And it has been recorded mixed pairs with the tropical and gray, interestingly enough. All right. Loggerhead kingbird, another fantastic species that you won't ever see in California, but certainly included here for completeness. It's a vagrant to Florida, another Caribbean specialty, black and white and sort of olive gray with a fantastically big bill. Also has a Twitter call as well. Okay. Here's a comparison of bellied kingbirds, gray, loggerhead, and eastern. Focusing on eastern, look at those white tips to the tail feathers, pretty unique and diagnostic. All right. Fork-tailed flycatcher, a dream bird for any birder in California to try and find. It is quite a regular vagrant throughout the sort of eastern portion of the states, a large number of records. There's a few records to the West Coast, including California, but it remains exceptionally rare. I think in LA County, the biggest confusion species seems to maybe be pin-tailed wider, which is not wildly different. They're also a black and white bird with an exceptionally long tail. But this bird is, is unmistakable. It's a long distance migrant, which leads to all of these vagrancy records. But yeah, fairly unmistakable. And closely looking bird, a scissor-tailed flycatcher, which is much more likely to occur. It's a pretty easy bird to get each year if you're a rarity chaser, it seems. Again, quite unmistakable. Doesn't really need a lot of description to it. I think in flight, the next slide we have in flight, Cin-Ty's noticed the stiff tail of scissor-tailed in flight versus the floppy tail of fork-tails when they're flying around. Both birds absolutely fantastic, though. Gorgeous. All right. And that's it. 8:06. Sorry, went a little bit over, but that's our holistic birding on kingbirds and Myiarchus.
And that was excellent. Thank you guys very, very much.
Wonderful.
Go ahead, Mark. There are a couple of questions I think are popping up.
Sure. And probably the first question that Andy and Cin-Ty want to hear. Laura asks, where can we buy the books?
You're too kind. Anywhere really. I mean, it's on Amazon or I think I had a feeling like Princeton. I don't know if they still are. Maybe Cin-Ty, were they doing a May sale? I feel like there was like huge discounts on all Princeton titles at some point recently. I don't know if it's still going on.
I think there's a 50% off for volume 1. Volume 1 is included in that.
Okay. Buy the pair. Okay.
But volume 2, I don't think there's a discount yet.
Okay.
So you can wait a year.
Wait a year, and then it'll be in the bargain bin. But yes, anywhere where books are sold, much appreciated.
Yeah, and Amazon, I mentioned this earlier to Cin-Ty and Andy. Amazon, of course, has it available for download on your pad. So these are wonderful, wonderful things to keep close by when you're traveling and all that.
I don't know does LA Birders have a Amazon store or something? I don't know if people should click through LA Birders to go there to support.
Amazon has finished their. We did, they have, but they no longer have Amazon stores.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
But thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Leo. Great question from Laura. Yvonne asks, do the two kingbirds whose males have notched outer primaries have a sound element to their courting behavior from the notched primaries?
Yeah, I think they do, and that may very well be the reason why the males have notched primaries. So when I think there was, you often see the kingbirds fluttering around, and they do make some sounds with the wings when they're courting. So I think there's some folks at UC Riverside that are studying the shapes of wings and on birds and the sounds they make, and I think they're talking about kingbirds possibly doing this as well. So
interesting.
Very cool. Yeah.
The Myiarchus don't do that. The kingbirds though.
The kingbirds will do that. Cool. Another question. Can you say the name of the sonograph app on the phone?
Well, I mean, there's Merlin, obviously, that everybody knows and loves. Obviously, there's always the caveats with be careful what it's telling you, but that does create a spectrogram as you're there, so you can see it. And then for me personally, I tend to upload recordings to my computer, and there's free software like Audacity, etc. that can make spectrograms for you. I don't know. Here you go. Lance has some apps for the phone. Song Meter Touch. Here, let me open his. What does his name?
Yeah, Song Meter Touch.
Create spectrograms in real time on phones. Okay.
Yes.
Song Meter Touch. Get that from the App Store.
Andy, I'm blanking. What's the name of the website with bird sounds?
So there's one called Xenocanto.
Oh, Xenocanto. Yeah.
Just
Perhaps
bird sounds.
that's what Yvonne meant.
Yeah,
Oh, thanks.
so that's a website, and that has all the tons of recordings from many people. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very good. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful site to go through.
Yes.
Okay. Oh,
Any
some
more
more questions are
questions?
popping. Oh, that was just Yvonne's. Okay.
Yes.
All right, and let me make sure we didn't miss anything. Oh, and Lance points out sonogram apps are, well, it's in the chat, but Song Meter Touch also creates spectrograms in real time on the phone. And Lance is typing away. In the meantime, I think this is a chance for another bird joke, Mark. No, just kidding, John. And what I can do is capture the chat to post if anything's relevant.
I mean, we should take this moment to really, thank, we talked about Xenocanto. I mean, we should really thank all of these birders, and there's probably most people on this webinar who upload their content and share it. When you upload it to eBird and you upload it to Xenocanto and iNaturalist, there's a lot of people who use those photos for research. And I know Cin-Ty and I, we'll pour through thousands and thousands of these photos, and it's very, very useful, and it's given us a chance to access live photos of live birds in a way you never had sort of 15, 20 years ago. And yes, there's lots of specimens there, and that's great and wonderful, but I do hope people realize just how useful that is. You may feel like loading your 20th photo of a Cassin's kingbird for the spring, and you may feel like, what's the point? But it really is incredibly useful. These pictures and these resources that you're uploading to help, and I'm sure many people here contributed photos that were very useful for creating illustrations and for researching a lot of this stuff. So thank you to everybody who goes out birding and documents and shares it with others. It's great.
Yeah, no, that's great. And also not only photos but also audio recordings, and if you don't know how to do audio recordings, we have some webinars that you can look to that Lance presented. Go to labirders.org and go to our YouTube channel, and you can find how-tos on sound recordings and sound recording equipment.
Absolutely. And Andy, and Cin-Ty, I meant to ask you, is there anything in the second volume that's lacking? I know in the first volume you had some color issues on some things.
I don't know. I'm sure there'll be stuff pointed out, and we appreciate it. I think, the first volume, there's things pointed out. It's a good chance to make corrections when we fold it all together into one book. So we appreciate it. I think Lance has pointed out sonogram missing for Eastern Wood Pewee. And we definitely had, on the first volume, we definitely had some captions swapped around. So, that's all good to fix. But I don't
there were
know
some
that we have any
small things in volume 1 and a couple of mistakes, typos, I guess, or captions switched. But it was great. We try to do the best, but
of course
errors can creep in, and but we're listening to feedback from all of you, and I think volume 2 we haven't heard that much yet about errors, and I think part of it is that we learned a little better how to streamline this and catch errors in in volume 2. So, but yeah, we welcome all comments, anything you see.
Yeah,
What
volume 2 is just spectacular. Volume 1 was wonderful. It knocked my socks off, but volume 2 really is a step above. It's wonderful. And also, Andy, I really love the black and white ink drawings.
Thank you.
I like to see the contrast that you're pointing out in structure, things like that. So thank you very much. You don't see that a lot in identification guides, so thank you. And anything else, Mark?
Are there any, yeah, are there, is there a list of the errors in volume 1 somewhere that you can, download
Oh.
on a website or something that you could, just in case yeah, so you have a list of, say, oh yeah, you should swap these two things, and this is actually a Dusky, not a Hammond's, and even though it's labeled the other way or whatever it is.
I don't know if we have a list, but I think there's a lot of, there's some, not a lot, but there's a few really small ones that aren't really that consequential, but there are maybe 3 that well, certainly one, I think we switched the labels on the bills of was it Dusky and Least? I can't remember, but
Yeah, one of them.
that's one. And then in the table of contents that crept in Acadian, the tiny thumbnails. Acadian is there, but that's not the end of the world. And
No.
and then of course, so I'm listing the 3 big ones. I think in our discussion, the gray flycatcher, really in the text, I kind of said it has all orange lower mandible, and of course, it has a little bit of a dark tip often, and sometimes they are all completely all orange, but we didn't nuance that, so gave the wrong impression that it was always orange. It's illustrated, I think, correctly in Andy's bills. So that one's on me for sure.
Great.
But those are the 3, I think. Yeah.
One of the first things that I learned to separate Cassins and Western was the tail coloring, the white outer web versus the whitish tip on the tail. So one of the questions is the whitish tip on the tail of Cassins kingbird diagnostic?
Well, oh yeah, go ahead, Andy.
No, you go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you see it, it's probably diagnostic, but I have to see that white tip very often, or it's hard to tell if it's really a white tip or it's just light shining through or it's wear and tear.
Right.
I tend not to use that myself, the white tip, because it's not on all the birds or it's not obvious. But I don't know what you think, Andy, but
Yeah, I think it's something you see, but I don't know that I would lead with that. I think it's possibly a little dangerous, I guess.
yeah, it's that the contrasty face, bright yellow underparts, dark chest that I use for Cassins. So.
Sounds good. Go ahead, Mark.
Another question from Yvonne.
I don't know. I mean, Andy and I aren't really biologists, so we probably can't answer that. But I will say, the kingbirds, they can feed on, of course, there are insects, but they're large insects that they will go after, like dragonflies, and in some cases they might even take a lizard. Or they feed on fruits too. Very, very different from empids that much smaller bills feeding on small guys. But yeah, I don't know. These larger bills that they're feeding on larger insects. That probably explains why the kingbirds and Myiarchus, they don't go up to the boreal forest if they don't have to. They're basically down with the U.S. southern birds, western birds, where the insects are bigger.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Great. Bob asks, do they all molt at the same time of year?
Uh, Not, I mean, I think there's variability, but typically the kingbirds, most of them are molting on their, or the really migratory ones, they're molting on their wintering grounds. That thick-billed, that really worn thick-billed kingbird from Arizona in the middle of the summer, some of these guys are, they don't move around that much and they're molting on the breeding ground, so, or during transit.
Okay. And Mark, I think we're running out of questions. I don't see anything else. Andy and Cin-Ty, thank you very, very much
Thank
for a
you.
wonderful
Well, thank
presentation.
you.
Yes,
We-
for
Yeah,
part
thank you.
two
It was
of
really
the
excellent.
yeah, it was fantastic, and so was part one. So
Yeah,
we're looking
absolutely.
forward to part three.
Yeah, we're waiting for part 3. Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So have you guys actually started work on volume 3?
I haven't. I've taken a little bit of a break, I must admit. I don't know about
Yeah.
Cin-Ty. I mean, Cin-Ty's amazing. He's done, I mean, every time I talk to him, he's in a different museum. I think he's now measured, I think something like 1,000 Empidonax specimens.
Oh, wow.
Primary space measurements on 1,000 different
Some
birds, from
really
New York
interesting
to
stuff that-
Louisiana to LA to, you know, every museum around the country.
Wow.
So I don't know that he ever stops really studying this group, but you know, he's coming up with all sorts of interesting findings with a lot of the specimen study. But
Well, I
I
think
personally taken a bit of a break from painting them, and you know, I'm now enjoying, you know, painting, you know, elegant birds with orange bills. I like the idea. Easier.
well, we're not. I don't think well, Andy's not painting, and I'm not writing at the moment. But of course, we're always talking and comparing notes on birds. So, in that sense, kind of we're working on it. But the actual process, like sitting down, starting, neither of us have started. We're birding too much too, so that's a problem.
Oh, that's never a problem.
And let's see here. One more quick question from Yvonne. From the very old specimens, from the very old specimens compared to the contemporary specimens, are you finding birds are getting smaller?
Boy, no. I mean, I haven't noticed that, but I actually haven't been making those measurements to really tell. And, I would be surprised if that were the case. I know some people have gone through specimens back to 100 years and showed that some of these birds are darker because of pollution. But I haven't seen anything else like that in terms of size. I think it would be very subtle and I wouldn't notice it.
Yeah, considering the
Oh,
feather coverage.
Yeah, and also these birds are, they're dead and they're stretched out. You have to make some correction for it being distorted after they're shot, and so.
Well, once again, I do want to thank you and Andy for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We are so looking forward to Volume 3 and anything else that you guys would like to present. Thank you very, very much. Mark?
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much, and looking forward to Volume 3.
Yep.
Go find a Nuttings. Go find the first LA nut.
There we go. There we go. That's what we need.
That sounds like
Absolutely.
something you could work on, Andy.
And don't forget, please join us next month in June. Next month is June for Lance's presentation on montane sounds and all that. We're looking forward to that. And with that, we'll see you all next month. Thank you all very much for attending. And thanks again to Andy and Cin-Ty for presenting. We'll see you all soon. Take care.
Yep,
Good
thank
night,
you.
everybody.
See you all
Thank
later.
you.
Good
This
night.
Good
was
night.
awesome. Great presentation.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.